Hello, folks. Welcome to the planetarium, or welcome back if you were here for the planetarium show just now. I hope you noticed on the way in that beautiful moon outside, a waxing gibbous moon. I've been kind of watching it for the last 10 days since it appeared as a little crescent, because we know that the moon is part of eclipses, right? And when it appeared as a crescent, it was on sort of the start of the countdown clock. And every night it moves about 12 degrees eastward through the sky. It will make one complete rotation. And at the end of that 1 month cycle, it will be back at the new moon phase and we'll have an eclipse. So I've been watching, and I hope you will too, night by night as the moon makes its final approach. We're really happy tonight to have Dr. Amilcar Challu with us. From the history department here at Bowling Green. He grew up in Argentina, spent some time wandering the world, I think. I think we spent some time in a small town in Chile. Maybe not at the exact same time, but the same place. Out of all the places in the world, we shared that small town. He moved on after that to Harvard, where he got a PhD. And then appeared here at Bowling Green, and we've been very happy to have him here ever since, as he studies sort of the environment and economics involved in history and the peoples throughout Latin America. And I should also mention, and I hope you'll talk a little bit more about this, that just earlier this week, the History Department's podcast called Eclipsing History dropped on Spotify and YouTube. And so you can search for those on the BGSU YouTube site is a great place to find that. And I think I'll let you say what the first episode is called, okay. But please take over with our discussion of eclipses in Mexican history.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to Andy, Kate. It's a pleasure to be here. When I was told, más alto. Yep. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Better? Yep. When I heard about the speaker series and Andy and Kate said, well, we're putting together this, and I said, it's in the planetarium. Yes, I want to be there, right? So this is like a kid's dream, right? But thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really honored. This is part of a project called Eclipsing History, with 12, 13 students, some of them here. We created a podcast that it's now being released. It's bgsu.edu/eclipsing history. The website is still in works, but I think within a couple of days, the episodes are going to be there, and they are already findable through Spotify and YouTube. So if you are interested in this, you may want to take a look at the podcast. But anyway, part of that research over the summer for the podcast involved like taking the whole arc of this eclipse. It's really a North American eclipse, right? And starts in Mexico, goes all through the States, and ends in Eastern Canada, right? So we wanted to portray that in the podcast, and I said, yeah, I take Mexico, right? And at the beginning, I thought, okay, it's going to be something very easy, right? I'm just get a few things here and there. And it got like very, very, I became very engaged in this topic, and people are like saying, yeah, you're like totally crazy with this eclipse stuff right now. But I found very cool stuff. Some stuff I could have predicted, like many of you probably. I watched Apocalypto, so I thought that, yeah, there were eclipses and some idea about prediction eclipses and things like that. But I found like very interesting weaving of histories through eclipse episodes that bridge like this huge diversity that it's Mexico. It's sometimes referred to as many Mexicos. And I could see in eclipses like these many Mexicos coming together. And that's a little bit what I want to bring in here. So, okay, patience with this. I'm starting now. As a historian, I'm trying to go through a timeline, right? And many of our students here, or the students who are here, are familiar with that. We like putting things in timeline. Why? Because we believe in narrative as a mode of explanation, that one thing follows the other, and that sequence is consequential, right? It's because things are ordered chronologically, one thing is affecting the next one, right? What I'm going to do here is going to be like a little bit of, I have two keyboards, so I don't know which one to press. It's going to be a little bit of an experiment, right? What I would call nonlinear history, as a nod to the astrophysicists here. And that's an image of the space-time continuum. And what I mean by nonlinear history, I mean it's a PR stunt, okay? But I like it anyway. So what I mean by nonlinear history, it's that in one event that I'm going to focus, the one eclipse, I can see like the ripples of time and space, like converging into that same place. I can see in that event of 1691 that we're going to talk about, like the long history of eclipses before it. But also I can see the echoes of what's going to happen. Even why we know about this eclipse in relatively more detail has to do with the future. So like all the timelines are condensed in this event of the August 23rd, 1691 that I'm going to talk about. I could also call it the multiverse history, and so that could be perhaps more interesting. And if we want to go boring and less and more precise, non-narrative history, right? I'm not following the sequence, but I'm like being very creative with time and space. Anyway, so I'm going to narrow this down to a tiny moment, the 6 minutes of one eclipse in 1691 in Mexico City. Mexico City was right in the path of totality, and see it from the perspectives of 3 different people or groups of people. And through their experience, hear the echoes of the past and the future. All right, so ready? Bear with me about it for this. And let me move one more. So this is the eclipse of August 23rd, 1691. If our 2024 eclipse, the one that is coming up really soon, right, is the Great North American Eclipse, because it connects the continent from Mexico to Canada, we could call this one, this 1691 one, the Great Latin American Eclipse, because it starts in what it was then called New Spain, Mexico, goes through the Spanish Main, Central America, what we call today Central America, New Granada, Colombia, and what today is Brazil. And Brazil was called Brazil. So we call our upcoming North American eclipse great, right? The Great North American Eclipse. Sure, but this one would be the really, really great because it lasted 6 minutes, right, in totality. And in Mexico City, it was a little bit farther away, and so it was 3.5 minutes, I believe. Can you hear me okay, or yeah?
Yeah,
Kind of,
better now.
yeah? Should I increase my volume a little bit?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, will do.
And
Yep.
while we're doing a
Yep.
technical thing, let me
Yep.
get this the heck out of the way.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry about that. And maybe I can get this out of the way too. We'll
Okay.
see. I'm hoping.
Oh, because it's all there, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it goes away and sometimes it doesn't. Anybody know how I can get rid of that darn thing?
Stop shit.
No,
I don't
not
wanna
stop
stop
sharing.
sharing.
Yeah, maybe more. It doesn't let you hide.
It
right?
doesn't, hide video panel? No.
No.
We may have to deal with that.
Yeah, we can live with that. Okay, so louder. I got the message. So this will be the really, really great eclipse, up to 6 minutes. So it was really something that made an impression, right? And how do we know about it? Well, in part because of things like this. This is a catalog of eclipses, or the canon, I think it's called, right? And that has the ephemeral, no, ephemeridus.
No, ephemeral.
Ephemerals. Ephemeris, which is like kind of the coordinates of this thing, right? The parameters. But also we know about it because there is a story or a narrative, a report written by a contemporary, Dr. Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, who I'm going to call Don Carlos, and he would kill me for that because I don't have the station to call him Carlos, but anyway, Don Carlos was a polymath, right? A man of many intellectual skills who was a professor of astronomy in the University of Mexico. He was Creole, that is born in Mexico, or what was known as New Spain, from Spanish ancestry. In a second, we're going to hear what he wrote about this eclipse. But first, let's try to revisit that eclipse here in the planetarium to see what the stars look like that day. So if I have to turn this off, right, for a second?
Yes. Two times.
So welcome to Mexico City, 1691, August 23rd. So as we are looking at this, let me read aloud what he wrote, what he said. So we arrived to the 23rd of August, in which the sun eclipsed, as almanacs and forecasts had announced. If your mercy would know anything about astronomy, I would tell you here in technical details, 1,000 good and quaint details that I observed that day, as it was not only a total eclipse, but one of the biggest, longest that the world has ever seen. Shortly after 8:45 in the morning, we entered into the night, not a good night, but a bad one. For almost a quarter hour, we found ourselves in the most terrifying darkness. Because it was unexpected, the birds that were flying dropped suddenly to the ground as soon as the light dimmed. The dogs howled, the women and the children screamed. The Indian women left their street shops and ran at full speed to the cathedral. The bells tolled at that same instant, not only in the cathedral, but in all churches of the city, causing sudden confusion and horrific outcries. And let me continue with his narrative. Meanwhile, I was extremely happy with my quadrant and magnifying glass, contemplating the sun. I was repeatedly thanking God for giving me the opportunity to see an event that occurs so infrequently in any given place and that has so few observations in the books. Mercury was just 5 degrees removed to the orient, to the east, and I could see with the lens how the moon was aligned and in the heart of the lion, which slowly progressed in its darkness. And farther away was Venus. Stars littered the sky all around, but only the stars of first, second, and third magnitude were visible. I observed in the moon a certain atmosphere, an observation that contradicts some accounts of similar events. Finally, from 8:30 to 9:30, the air was so cold and uncomfortable as if it were winter. This verifies the aphorism of the astrologers who attribute this change in temperature to eclipses, especially to solar eclipses. And that's the eclipse of 1691. Probably I took also 5 minutes to read it, right? Do you want to turn on the, oh, I have to, 2 clicks, right?
One. Sure. Yep.
Okay, let me. Okay.
Meanwhile, I was extremely cheerful with my quadrant and magnifying glass.
That's my, whoops. I created that one with ChatGPT, so I should give partial author credits to ChatGPT or DALI, I think it's called. With some poetic license, let me argue here that in that day we have 3 eclipses, or better said, 3 experiences of the eclipse. 2 of them are hypothetical and 1 real. So we have the experience of Carlos de Sigüenza and Góngora, the astronomer. You already heard his words. Then we have the eclipse of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, the poet nun. And if you know a little bit of Spanish literature, this is someone of the standing of Shakespeare, right? It's one of the big names in literature in the Spanish language. And then Marcela de la Cruz, the plebeian. And that's, if Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, I know she lived in that moment and was there in that moment, but it's a hypothetical eclipse for me because I don't know much about what she experienced. But Marcela de la Cruz, the plebeian, is totally made up. She got married in the cathedral 1693, and when she got married, she was registered as an Indian woman married to a carpenter. Carpenters had stalls in the same market that people took their produce to. So I speculate that because they probably met in the street markets, and she's referred to as Indian, that maybe she was there, right? Anyway, but the third eclipse, or this first eclipse, sorry, that I'm going to talk about, would be better referred to as a plebeian eclipse. So let's go a little bit into Marcela de la Cruz. So again, this is a character that I met in the archives, in a marriage record. Anytime that someone got married, they had to ask for 2 witnesses and post a notice so that if someone had an objection, they could object. So this idea that in the middle of a wedding, you can have someone saying, "Hey, I object." That's not the way it happens. It's way more bureaucratic. You put a notice, and if you have an objection, you put it in writing, right? So this is how I know about her. Mexico, she's from Mexico City. And Mexico City was built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Mexico City is a city brimming with life in this time period and today, of course. And it was truly a court city that had a viceregal palace, a magnificent cathedral, lots of convents. There were no architectural remnants of old Tenochtitlan at this point. They are going to be rediscovered 100 years later. The Spanish city erased the memory of the Aztec capital, even though a large part of the population was indigenous and spoke indigenous language, particularly Nahuatl, and lived in clearly identified native neighborhoods. So I said that Marcela was registered as an Indian, and here I need to make a qualification. A, I'm using the word Indian, which is the word that was used at that time, right? I know it sounds politically incorrect, but Indian and indigenous is something that it's a little bit different. Indian is someone who has tributary status as an Indian. Basically, you don't pay certain taxes, you pay other taxes, and you have some access to special courts and things like that. So there are actually people of African descent who are labeled Indian. There are people of Spanish descent that are labeled Indian if they were adopted into communities that were that had an Indian status. So when we use the word Indian, it's a little bit tricky, right? But even trickier in the case of Mexico, because people like Marcela would be registered as Indian in their marriage, but then then they have kids and they may be registered as mestizo. And then for something else, they may be registered back as Indian or Spanish. You never know. So what mattered here, it was not that much that label in itself. It was who they were with, how they were speaking, who they palled around, what were their social circles, how they were wearing and things like that, what they were wearing and things like that. And this was never called race, right? It's not that it doesn't fall within our category of race. It was known as quality. But again, the idea is that when you're talking about someone being Indian, it's way more than what today we understand in ethnic as ethnicity or race. The other thing is that social relationships were quite fluid, and the recording of this quality, race, drifted a lot. Moreover, we know that in these street markets, there were people that it identified in many, many different ways. And this is a picture of that, right? Quite in the background, we have the Palace of Government. On the left, we have the cathedral, and all this is the in the middle. It's all the markets that were in the central square in Mexico City. It was a very fluid environment, right? Especially the market. And we can see another picture here, right? A very fluid environment. To me, that calls into question why he's so specific, why Don Carlos is so specific, why Indian women, why not just women, or why not the populace, or the plebeians, or whatever word. And that tells a little bit something about social relations in Mexico, and particularly talks about these echoes from the future. Because this passage that we read, that I just read, of the eclipse, it's a prelude to the description of a big rebellion in 1692. A rebellion that started with a drought, where the eclipse, in his view, radicalized people, made people like think in ways that, wow, the end of the world is coming, millenarism, right? We can call that, and predisposed people to rebel. And he thought primarily that were Indians who were rebelling, the Indian neighborhoods, right, that were rebelling. There's no evidence that that rebellion was particularly strong among indigenous peoples. It seems to be that it cut across many different social groups, but he purposefully created this report identifying indigenous peoples as or Indians, sorry, as the culprit. So this description of the eclipse having this effect on the mind of weak people, in quotation marks, right? Weak rationally, right? I think it harks back to this legacy and this presence of a colonial mindset, and also speaks of his framing of this other event. So that's echo number one. I cannot separate then this description of the eclipse from the reality that he wrote it after 1692. And just to show you the extent of that rebellion, where is it? Here, right? If you take a look at the close-up here, you see that all the southern wing of the Palace of Government is burned down to the ground. It was the only rebellion in Mexican history that really did this to the Palace of Government. I mean, the viceroy had to escape in the last minute. It was memorialized for decades after that. And I study 18th century. I know about this from records in the 18th century. People say, hey, we don't want to repeat what happened in 1692, right? When there was another famine in 1785, the viceroy was like just going out to the streets and like throwing his cape so that people could walk over the cape, making every gesture possible to signify that they cared, right? 1692 was a very low point in the standing of the viceregal authority in Mexico due to this famine. Okay, oops, and I anticipated what I was going to say, but it's good. So this description of the fear of the sun, I kind of read it like in another key. Is it really fear of the sun, or is this reflecting fear of these plebeians, of this social mobilization, this potential of unrest, right? That it's there, right? It's like, I had a nice expression for this and I forgot about it. Oh, here it is, and I'm proud of this writing. Could the eclipse be a reminder that their rule was also eclipsed, even if temporarily, by the crowd, right? And I'm getting to an idea that the eclipse is a temporary suspension of order. And for those on literature, I'm going Bakhtin here, right? But I will go later into that if I have time, but I doubt it. Echoes from the past. And let's go back to the idea of, I'm losing track of my notes, sorry about it. So I also see echoes from the past, right? From the experiences of indigenous peoples in Mexico and Mesoamerica in general. There's a very thick culture about eclipses. And I want to bring that back a little bit because I see echoes of these experiences in Don Carlos's account. Mexico City was the land of the Mesika, right? We call them sometimes the Aztecs. That would be the one way, right? But truly they were known as the Mesika, the people from Mexico. And Mexico was not the country as we know it today. It was Mexico City and the valley, right? The valley that has the lakes on which Mexico City stood. And so until the 19th century, Mexico meant this. It's only after Mexico became independent and then they figure out, New Spain is really not such a great name for an independent nation. How are we going to call this, right? And Mexico. So the transition from Mexico as a valley to Mexico as a country occurred after independence. So I'm going to refer to them as Mexica. We know a lot about Mexica culture, right? And we know a lot about Mexica culture because we do have codices. There's a long continuity as well in terms of the population. Still today, we have a strong indigenous population that speak Nahua and other indigenous languages. I think over 10 million people in Mexico speak languages other than or indigenous languages. But also because of the missionaries that started to arrive in the 1520s. Among them was Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. Fray Bernardino de Sahagún had like this passionate interest about native peoples, right? And remember that this is a little bit complicated. We sometimes tend to think that conquest is like just one thing. There are actually very different agendas and paradigms of conquest. These friars were complicated. They are very interested in conversion. They consider of course, Christian religion superior, but at the same time, they are truly interested in this culture. So Fray Bernardino de Sahagún went all the way to learn the language and to meet with people and interview them. And particularly, he interviewed Mexica savants and principals, the leaders of the communities, and kept the interviews in Nahua, and then translated them into English. So what we are reading on the right-hand side is that Nahua writing. In one chapter that deals with beliefs and knowledge, he deals particularly with, the chapter is called The Sun. And this passage that I'm going to have read here is a rendition an English translation of this passage that I revised from a translation from the BBC. So let's hope it works. Again, thank you to AI. I don't have to read this aloud. So,
when the sun eclipses, it turns red. It looks restless and troubled, faltering. When the people see this, there is tumult and disorder. All are disquieted, unnerved, frightened. Women weep loudly and men lift their voices and shriek. There is shouting and howling everywhere. People of white hair and light complexion were slain as sacrifices, and so were captives. All offered their blood. In all the temples, there was singing and tolling of the bells. It was thus said, if this is complete, it will be dark forever. The demons of darkness will come down, and they will eat men.
okay. Do you notice the different tenses that this is using? I find that particularly fascinating. It starts saying when the sun eclipses, it turns red. All are disquieted, unnerved, frightened. Women weep loudly and men lift their voices, right? There is shouting and howling everywhere. Then, people of white hair and light complexion were slain as sacrifices. All offered their blood. In all temples, there was singing and tolling of the bells, right? So I find it very interesting, that contrasting between the present tense and the past tense. the eclipse is in the present, but these actions in the temples, particularly these religious actions, are in the past, right? But that shouting and howling is in the present, and I found that very interesting, right? So I looked at the canon of 500 or 5,000 eclipses, and actually during Sahagún's lifetime in Mexico, there were two big eclipses. They were partial, but quite noticeable, over 70%, 180% of obscuration. And then like 5 others that were partial, like 40%. So I wonder, did he experience this, right? That's why he's using the present. Maybe not a sacrifice, but he's seeing all the howling and the shouting. But I also noticed a second thing, right? That this text was not known by Sigüenza Góngora, by Don Carlos. This was only, became known in the 19th century, right? Spanish Empire is a great bureaucracy. You have like this 1,000-page report, and they file it, right? And 200 years later, someone finds it, like our assessments, right? Probably. So he didn't know this text, but somehow he's echoing exactly the same things. There's a lot of crying, women are weeping, right? And there's howling. Now the text here says that the howling comes from humans, not from dogs, right? And then people go to the temples and the bells toll. Actually, the word that it's used is tañer. It's like tolling the bells, but it could be like making noise out of other things. So I don't know if there were bells or not. But again, the noise coming from the temple, right? Isn't that interesting, right? And before I go on with something else, I would like to now move to one of the interviews we had in the podcast, an interview to a rural school teacher from Durango. Durango is right where that star is in the map. And his name is Esteban Rios. He's from the Audam community in Mexico. It's a native community with a language that is very loosely related to Nahua, very loosely. I mean, there are some commonalities, but it's not, it's far removed. And I wanted to hear his description in Spanish, and you can read the text in English here. He's describing an eclipse in 1991 that actually he was right in the path of totality while doing his training as a rural school teacher back in the Audam communities. Ready? Is the volume okay, or should we need to try to make it louder? Or I think, well, let's go. No, sorry, it's translated.
Pues, del principio, pues bueno, como acá la tradición, pues bueno, igual de los ancestros, nuestros ancestros, abuelos que nos platicaban que bueno, los eclipses eran de mala seña, ¿no? Ese era un castigo de nuestro padre, ¿verdad? Sí, entonces dice, pues es que en ese día o en ese momento hay que tener pues precaución, dice, pues entonces ellos decían en esos, pues, cuando se oscurece de día, dicen, nos platicaban pues que pues las piedras se vuelven serpientes o los zapatos que tienes ahí te pueden hacer daño porque se convierten en algún animal, o sea, eso es lo que nos platicaban, ¿verdad? Pero comentan que, bueno, durante un eclipse, cuando sucede eso, dice que pues, las personas empiezan a golpear piedras, ¿verdad? Ese objeto empiezan a golpearlo para que el sol sane, ¿no? Porque dice, es que el sol se enfermó, ahora sí necesita que nosotros oremos por él y a través con los sonidos, las piedras, pues le estamos dando buenas vibras para que para que sane pronto, ¿verdad? Y no nos coma el demonio. Eso es lo que me comentaban, pero como yo os digo, yo ya no vi no alcancé a ver esa tradición, pero platicaban eso, que sí, que eso es lo que debe de hacer, ¿verdad? O se debe de hacer.
Okay. So this is Esteban narrating his experience. And I cannot help seeing parallels again with the 1691, right? Eclipse. I don't think it's exactly the same by any stretch of the imagination, but there are echoes, as I say, reverberations, ripples here. Again, the idea of, recall the women running to the church, right? And here, the family asking the children and everybody to stay under the roof, right? I think that idea of seeking refuge in the house or in the temple, especially or in the cathedral, I think it's quite significant. There was a lot of emphasis in his narration not to look at the sun, right? That was big, that they were very concerned with looking directly at the sun. And also not knowing what's going on, the fear and things like that. I wonder if that's idea of staying within the house, it's not also something behind the women running to the cathedral, right? Notice also the idea of making a lot of noise, right? Which is not just among indigenous peoples in the Americas. There are narrations all over the world that also are similar. But again, I see this description of disorder that Don Carlos had as reflecting these practices as well, captured in 1991, right? So I wonder how much there is here fear, right? And that would be my conclusion. And I'm skipping some things, the conclusion for this part. You're not off the hook completely. I wonder here, going back to the plebeian eclipse, how much these people's reactions are fear, or maybe the performance of fear, and how much this performance that happens within a lapse of 3, 4, 5 minutes, probably they didn't know how long it was going to last, right? But could it also be like all this shouting and things like that, like a reversal of order? Because all these descriptions talk about the sun being killed, right? The sun being murdered, and we need to rescue the sun, right? But it's kind of like a carnivalesque event, right? Where you have like, yeah, for a few hours, New Orleans is party, 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 right? And then, boom, back to normal again, right? The carnival as a sudden disruption that flips the order top down, and then it goes eventually back to the normal. I wonder how much of a performance then we have in these social attitudes. I wanted to say one more thing, and this is what I skipped, but I'm going to show the slide because I'm very proud of it. That there's a big change in public attitudes too, that it's noticeable in the 19th century. As the predictions become more and more accurate and more widespread, there's a change from fear more to a sort of party mood or curiosity mood, right? And there's a lot of, in the press, a lot of coverage about eclipses, right? And how you can see them. Let's go there. How you need to take the tramway a little bit north. And so you can see the totality, not just a partial eclipse, you can see the total eclipse, right? And anyway, let me go through the second eclipse, but I'll go fast, right? And I'll skip more stuff. How are you holding up?
Great.
Good? Yeah, okay, thank you. So Carlos de Sigüenza en Góngora, Don Carlos, as I call him, it's the author of our quote. And here we have really a man of science who is happy observing, happy to an extreme, right? And this was, I mean, again, like a long eclipse, etc. He had good bragging rights for calling it like one for the ages. But also, he's contributing here to the scientific understanding, right, of the universe. He verified that the temperature dropped, so that what astrologers typically say, I verified, right? I'm using the astrologer means astronomers in this context. He observed, I mean, things like the Mercury, 5 degrees, etc., etc. He observed the solar corona as well. He calls it the moon's atmosphere. And we talked a little bit about it, that it wasn't clear at this point what was that, right? But he's documenting, he's part of this scientific revolution. And Latin America was right, or what we call now Latin America, was, I mean, by the time that Harvard was created, there were 18 universities in Latin America. Kino, like a famous astronomer, was a Jesuit who taught or had lectures in the University of Mexico that Sigüenza Góngora attended, right? All these colonies were really part of the intellectual and scientific life that we call the scientific revolution. But there's something about Sigüenza Góngora too that makes it a little bit different as well. Because what we are seeing is not just, hey, this is another step in building science. He's also stressing that he's very proud that this is happening in Mexico. In some ways, he's a proto-nationalist, or better said, a Creolist, someone who is claiming that, yeah, we do science in Mexico, we do good things in Mexico. And in this, I also hear echoes of the future of science in Mexico. Let me. He was a very happy guy. DALI, no, that's another service. It's there. Media.io. Thank you, Media.io, for your free service. I also wanted to say that he wanted to be a Jesuit, but was expelled because he ran away during the night. To watch stars, I don't know. He was eventually professor of mathematics and astrology and royal cosmographer, and never reinstated in the Jesuits. He was a priest though, but he was buried in the Jesuit, one of the Jesuit churches in Mexico City. Anyway, and this is a stamp, right? This is a big name in Mexican science and in Mexican history. Okay, I'm going to run through this. We don't need really to, but Mesoamerican astronomical knowledge was, I mean, one truly amazing feat in terms of the level of prediction that they have. They could predict not only lunar and moon, lunar and solar cycles, but also the Venus cycle. The idea, the mathematics were quite sophisticated as well. It's believed that they were able, I think it's more than believed, it's documented that they could predict eclipses, although we were talking yesterday that maybe not at the level of the minutes, right? But they could know what was going to happen. And so we are building on a very long tradition, and that sometimes shows in newspaper reports, which are interesting, some dialogues that I'm not going to bring here, but I'm happy to talk more about. But I mentioned that he was a Creolist, right? And that he identified as a Creole, someone from Mexico. He had a passion about Mesoamerican cultures. He defended a principle from a community north of Mexico City, and as a gift for having defended the community in a land dispute with an hacendado, with a landowner, a Spanish landowner, he was given manuscripts that the community was holding, or that this family was holding. And so he learned Nahua to be able to understand these manuscripts. And it's amazing. We know a lot about the early colonial period, the decades after the conquest, because of these manuscripts that he had and deposited in a library. When the viceroy came in 1680, a new viceroy came in 1680, he was invited to create an Ark of Triumph, a triumphal ark, which was a temporary exhibit to welcome the viceroy, who had all the attributes of being the king. And for the first time, and the only time that I know of, that Arc of Triumph was not based on classical themes or even religious themes. It was a history of the Aztec Empire, right? So it was telling the viceroy, hey, look, you are entering into this city that was the capital of a great empire, right? He was very proud about that indigenous past, which makes it even more interesting, that contrast of the description of the eclipse. And I can go into that later on. But what I wanted to highlight here is that he was a professor of astronomy. It was a chairship in the university that others held, and astronomical knowledge was a big part of the curriculum of the university of that time. And I wanted to bring up this thing here, this, how do we call this? This orthographic description of the eclipse of the sun, created in 1778 by Leon y Gama. And it was quite a feat. It was the fourth map of an eclipse trajectory, according to the author. I don't know if it's true or not, but the fourth one ever done. And it's based on Kepler, Cassini, big names in the history of astronomy. But perhaps the most interesting excerpt about this chart created by Leon y Gama is not anything he wrote, but what the ecclesiastical censor wrote about it. Everything that was published had to go through ecclesiastical censorship. Someone had to say, yes, it can be published. This is not against the doctrine. Here's what the censor wrote. The small work that your excellency has sent to me for my approval, presented by Don Antonio de Leon y Gama, is a repeated proof of the capacity, ingenuity, and application of our Americans. Americans with not us, Americans as people from the Americas, right? Born in the Americas. A repeated proof of the capacity, ingenuity, and application of our Americans. I am sure that in no part of the learned world it has been done better in terms of astronomical calculations, right? See all that kind of national pride, right? Before independence, right? That's why I call it creolism, right? Like this pride for this unique identity that they are carving, particularly among these elite groups. So in the context of independence and the status of Mexico as an independent nation, this is going to be even more important. Mexico, as the United States went through 45 years before Mexican independence, is trying to assert the legitimacy, that it's a legitimate nation in the choir of nations, of civilized nations. And science and the generation of knowledge was quite important, and particularly more if you can say, look, we are the only ones who can have this specialized knowledge about our own area. Localized knowledge was quite important to assert the authority of these scientists in the world. This is a concept that historian Rebecca Earle calls the republics of knowledge, right? So even when they are erring in the prediction of an eclipse by 3 minutes, they blame Baron von Humboldt from Germany because he gave the wrong coordinates for Mexico City, right? And it was a huge subject of political mockery if someone erred the prediction of an eclipse. Knowledge was prestige, right? And newspapers start to report on that, right? This is a map of Mexico that we have here, and newspaper reports galore about where to watch the eclipses and things, and what the astronomers are doing, and even more, who are coming from other countries to see the eclipses with the Mexican Astronomical Society, right? It's like a joint party between the Mexican and the United States Astronomical Commission in 1923. And the great regret they had is it was cloudy, so they couldn't observe the test of the relativity theory that you can check during an eclipse. And I'm not going to get there because I would embarrass myself. I don't know how that works, but that was a big thing. We couldn't test Einstein's relativity theory. You know, we are part of this general movement of advancement of science. There's also the beginning of citizen science. The Astronomical Society will start giving forms to people who wanted to observe and record things in different parts of the country. And the map in the background is not trivial, right? The idea of the nation is also coming through these constant reminders that we are part of a bigger community, even one that we cannot see, that we can only imagine. The map is a great tool to imagine this community, this nation, right? The eclipse works in exactly the same way. It starts in Durango, it goes into Chihuahua, and then exits there. And they don't care what happens after the border, right? Or it hits in Campeche, and then it goes all the way through Veracruz. They are telling the people, hey, it's like when we are ourselves seeing the maps of this eclipse, right? How often we are seeing the band on the map of the United States, right? It's also a way to reinforce the idea that we are a nation, right? And the eclipse is working in that way, and it's happening at the time that this nation is being built as a new modern nation. Anyway, then there's the last one, and I promise this is the end of it, right? And I'm not going to dig deep into this one, but it's the eclipse of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Lived only 44 years. She's referred as a 10th muse. I mean, again, has a standing of William Shakespeare, and perhaps more interestingly for me, she was like best friends with Carlos de Sigüenza-Góngora. They met all the time in the locutory of the convent. So it was an area where there was like a fence dividing the room. So men would be, or visitors on one side and the nuns on the other side. There was always one nun who had to be supervising what was going on. And they had talks about astronomy and about many different things. They had lots of interests in common, including Nahua language and things like that. She was an astronomy aficionado, and an inventory of the things in her room, in her apartment, in the convent, included an astrolabe, but also magnifying glasses, which is probably like a telescope. Anyway, so I'm sure they were observing, talking a lot about these eclipse things that were happening. And yet, if we take a look at the chronology here of her last years of her life, 1690, she publishes like one of her most important works, the Divine Narcissus. It's like an analogy between the mythological character of Narcissus and Christ. And what happens, I mean, in the crucifixion, there's a description of a solar eclipse, which actually never, there could have not been a solar eclipse at that time in that area. But anyway, but typically the crucifixion of Jesus is associated with an eclipse in religious discourse. So she's equating, it's super complicated stuff, like what she always does, and I cannot even fathom that I don't understand it at all. But it's prominently about an eclipse. Was she getting ready for 1691, right? Like we are right now, like getting prepped up for the eclipse and writing about it? Well, the eclipse comes, right? 1691, and what do we hear from her? Nothing, zero, zip, right? No reference to the eclipse whatsoever in anything that she wrote. And in fact, the most interesting thing is that she practically wrote nothing after the eclipse, right? Why? And here's the key. What happened right before, right? from November 1690 to March 1691, the Bishop of Puebla published an open letter in Puebla that basically said, hey, you are a woman, right? You should, if you are good at writing, just write about religious stuff. Don't get into any theological argument because that's beyond your station. And stop writing these poems that have nothing to do with religion. Just stick to being stick to being a nun, right? Of being a pious nun. And of course, like using very different language than he used, but it was very, very aggressive, and it was anonymous in theory, but everybody knew it was the Bishop of Puebla. For one, it was published in Puebla, and he was a censor of the publication. So he really was quite into that, and it was published in record time. So censors are bureaucrats, so they take their time to do things. So it hurt her very, 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 very deeply. And she wrote a response, and the response is amazing, basically asserting the right of women to learn and to also serve God through their knowledge, that they have all the right, women have all the right to discuss theology. And she gave like tons of examples of wise women in the church, right? But truth is that after that, the equation of the support that she had changed completely. Her confessor said, I'm not going to deal with you anymore. That's it. Just find another confessor. And her relationship with the confessor was quite important. And the people who supported her in Mexico City, the viceroy and the viceroy's wife in particular, had left, and she didn't have that support, that political coverage, we would say. In a way, I would say that this eclipse was kind of her own eclipse, right? She was basically silenced. And maybe she chose also to be silent. We don't know. We know very little about those last 4 years of her life, but coincide with the eclipse very clearly. I'm not saying that the eclipse caused this just by putting this in the timeline. But there are a couple of little hints that she was thinking about the eclipse, though. In November 1691, she published a prayer for a saint, Saint Catherine of Alexandria. She's one of those wise women that I was talking about. She was the symbol of the woman philosopher, who was also dedicated her life to the church. And look at that sentence from there. Impure vapors wanted to eclipse this bright moon. Okay, it's not eclipsing the sun, but close enough. And then she always published every year the prayers for Saint Peter in his festivity in June. The one that she published after the eclipse described Saint Peter as the sun, right? And all this imagery of shadows and how things are trying to shadow the brightness of the sun of Saint Peter. So is she writing about the eclipse? No, but I kind of think that there are some reflection here, that she's thinking about it, right? But it's truly the eclipse of Sor Juana. She started getting, I mentioned that there was a famine equals epidemics. She got sick, she recovered, but never recovered her full health. 1694, she is in a downward spiral. Seems like she's quite depressed as well. She writes a testimony saying, I renounce to any secular knowledge. From now on, I'm only going to just spend my time in praying. Then the week before she died, she wrote her last wishes for her burial. And in the signature, she signed, I, the worst of all, right? Which is very well known in literature circles, I think. So I end this this story here of these 1691 3 eclipses, right? With Carlos's happy eclipse, where he could prove to the world that science was strong in New Spain. With the plebeians eclipse, Marcela De La Cruz's eclipse, those hungry and seeking answers from the authority, also seeing in the eclipse perhaps an echo of power. And Sor Juana's eclipse, at the peak of her recognition, her stuff was getting published in Spain while she was going through all this. She was betrayed and gaslighted and started a down spiral that led to her ultimate death, right? So thank you for your patience.
Are there any questions?
Do you know what? Sorry, do you know when Carlos was expelled from the Jesuits? Because I'm assuming after he was expelled, he didn't talk much with Sor Juana.
Yeah, no, the other way around. He was expelled very early on. He was in the 60s, 68, I think, expelled. So basically what happened is he was expelled from the Jesuits, so he became a secular priest. So a priest that it's not attached to a parish. Basically what that means is he didn't have income. So he had to publish every year his almanac to make income. Yeah.
He had the possibility of still talk to.
Yes, yes. And he became very well known as well. And he became a professor in the university, I don't recall exactly when, in the 70s, I believe. Yeah, 1670s. So he was well known. I mean, it's not that he was a pariah in this society. Yeah. Yeah. Make sense? Or?
Yeah, I just wonder if they had time to talk about the eclipse at that time.
Yes, because Sor Juana's is the convent. All the convents are nearby. They are like here in Bowling Green, let's say, right? It's one. But second, yes, she had like weekly meetings in the convent, in the locutory where they could meet people, and they met regularly. Yes.
Even after she was censored.
After she was censored, not. Right, after 1690, not 91, after 1694, she stopped receiving people, yes. Yeah, up to 1694, yes. But it's interesting too, because Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora also kind of eclipses after the eclipse. And the last work he published was this account of the rebellion of 92. But I know that they were still in contact, and after the eclipse, I think after 94, they were not. Yeah.
I think Sor Juana's eclipse is very different from the other one because
Yeah.
her eclipse was provoked by the patriarchal church.
Uh-huh.
It was silent.
Mm-hmm.
Not an eclipse,
Mm-hmm.
no?
Yeah, and in a way, it's like the anti-eclipse, because if the eclipse is only 3 minutes, this was truly like the end of the world for her. I mean, yeah. So it's like the prophecy became, yeah. Yes.
You said that Mesoamerican astronomer can pick eclipses and such, and you've been a stellar object. How widely known are these types of knowledge in the general population? Were they shared by the astronomers? And follow up your question, was it also shared for by the standard other scholars? It's 1691 it goes from to the general population.
Yeah. So the press in Mexico truly starts in the late 1720s, the first experiment of a weekly or a bi-weekly newspaper, and it lasts 10 years. And then from 1790 or 1785 on, yes, we always had, Mexico City always had a newspaper, and by the 19th century, they are in different towns. So it's with newspapers that the knowledge becomes way more widespread. And it's very interesting because these newspapers and pamphlets were written were published, the people bought them, but also read them aloud. There's a lot about reading them aloud in the corners of streets and in intersections, and people talking about the news, right? Typically, what's referred in these accounts are political news, right? But why not about an eclipse as well, right? So it's mostly in the 19th century when this knowledge becomes more widespread. Before that, what we have is something called the almanac. So every year, someone like Sigüenza and Góngora would publish the almanac, and basically it was mostly about seasonal stuff. This is the patron saint is in this day and that. So make sure to plant in this season or in these days, things like that. But that's where they would also talk about these predictions as well, these astronomical predictions. They didn't circulate that widely. For this more wide distribution, we need to wait more into the 19th century. So we definitely know that in the 18th century, they are, or in the 17th century, people are not that aware of the eclipses. I would say as early as 1803, I have references that that people were like waiting for the eclipse, right? That the population in Mexico City was waiting for the eclipse, things like that. And still there are reports 20 years later that an eclipse caught everybody by surprise in another town in Mexico, in Durango, actually. So it was uneven. I would say the second half of the 19th century, absolutely. You can tell that the ground is being prepped. Yeah.
Can you talk about the human sacrifices of those humans of light complexion? Where did they happen?
I would love to be able to read now for that, because I bet that there's something tricky about that. So the BBC translation said light complexion, right? And when I read the Spanish translation made by Sahagún, he emphasized white hair and similar skin, right? And I don't know, I wish I could tell a little bit more about that. It's the first time I hear about complexion in the context of Mesoamerican cultures. I never heard about it, yeah.
So albino?
It could be that. It could be albino, actually. That's a very good point. It could be albinos, yeah. Yeah, I never thought about that, yeah.
Was that a reaction to the particular eclipse of 1691?
The
sacrifice?
No. 1691, there were no sacrifices.
Right?
Yes, yeah.
So where does this come from? Like from which era?
More pre-Columbian, yes. Yes. And you're right, albinos definitely were subject of sacrifices in other contexts. So I look into that. yeah.
But, I mean, just going back to that particular description, this is a description by Carlos.
Yes.
It's in a way a little bit what you are doing here with us. You are bringing history.
Yeah.
And Carlos, in writing that in a way, is bringing
the pre-Hispanic
history, which is his proud, or he tried to rescue the historical ancestry of the Mexicans.
Yeah,
so you could interpret it.
Yeah, I wonder how much he knew about Mesoamerican astronomy. I really don't know. He knew that.
He knew
about the reactions.
Normal sacrifices done during major events.
Yes.
Whatever.
No, it is. What I notice in Sigüenza y Góngora is that in the 1680s, he has very pro-Aztec views, to put it in a way. And after the rebellion of 1692, he flipped. He flipped completely. So I'm seeing his text about the eclipse more as as a negative, as a negative reflection on indigenous culture. Yeah, that's my take. Yeah. But it's definitely a change in the mood. Yeah. And actually, the pintura de castas that are so well known, right? That one, these portraits that are basically what it says is from a mestizo and an Indian comes a coyote, right? So the Spanish had a formalized system of castes in which the children of two interracial of an interracial couple would be like very specifically designated. People did not go by this at all, right? This is very much elite. That's how the elites wanted to represent their social order, but it starts after 1692. So this is from 1715, for instance. You don't have casta paintings before that moment. Yeah. So there is a flip in the perception of indigenous cultures, particularly. Yeah.
Perhaps time for one more question. If not, let's thank Dr. Challu again.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I'm sure he'll take other questions. As you leave, and we've got more Eclipse glasses if you'd like some as you leave as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
I have a question, Dr. Challu. Why did you write lineal